6 years. I had heard about it maybe 2 years before that. So it must have been a very new school when I heard about it, but I didn't know. I thought it was just like the city's best kept secret. And I heard about it because my daughter was in ninth grade in high school, and she made a friend whose little sisters went here. And he told her about it because she shared with him that she had two little brothers who were both on the autism spectrum, who were doing fine in their, structured, scaffolded public school with a lot of special education supports program. But like, just in case we ever needed to think outside the box, like, here was this school that his sisters went to, that it was completely independent learning, and he was sort of jealous of them that they could do anything they wanted. Was the of course, none of us believed you could actually do anything you wanted, but that's how he sold it to her, and she came home and sold it to me. And I immediately put it in my back pocket because I thought, I don't know how these kids of mine are going to progress, and I need to remember that this place is here, because I suspect one day we're going to run screaming from the public school system. And I don't know what made me think that, because, I went to public school my whole life. Of course, I'm not autistic to my knowledge. The kid's dad went to public school. Like, my daughter was in public school. We were a firm believer in public schools. Like, I didn't like the idea of like opting out of the public school, because I thought there was sort of like there's like an elitism factor when you have to pay, and how much you pay, and how good the school is. And I just like, no. So it never occurred to me we would opt out of a public school. But I also knew that I had these kids who were potentially little misfits. And while they were doing fine that year, about 2 years later, they stopped doing fine. And that's when I remembered that I had heard about this place. That's not to say that they would have necessarily been a good fit here either, because I think when you have kids on the spectrum, they're going to be as different from each other as kids not on the spectrum are going to be. But I think there are going to be some challenges when it comes to maybe how they would choose to structure their day. One of my kids was exceptionally rigid and schedule oriented, and could have been completely at sea here. The other kid is the opposite. Wouldn't know what a schedule was if one whacked him in the face, and that lack of structure here, it could have sent him into a complete tizzy, and it was possible that it wouldn't have been a good fit. But when we left the public school, because it just became intolerable for both of them, it ended up being a good fit. Although both of those things did happen. The more structured kid really tried to create his own structure, but he had the space and the freedom to do so. And my unstructured kid ran around like a complete nut and learned over and over and over and over where the boundaries were. He found that wall that he could throw himself against, metaphorically speaking, every time he got written up, every time his peer group came back at him with, that's not acceptable, that's not acceptable. And over the course of time, he learned, I guess, not how to behave, but how to make friends, how to have fun. They'd never learned that in school, and being not socially inclined, it wasn't something they were good at or initiated. They didn't run around at recess and casually make friends. I mean, they were awkward at best, but they were pretty much born reading and writing and doing math. So taking them to a place that didn't have an academic focus didn't matter to me. They had basics. They needed to learn how to make friends and how to be people who could have conversations and who could have fun and who could find interests, and that would have never ever happened if they hadn't been here. It would have never happened in public school. It would have never happened in a traditional private school. It would have never happened if I had homeschooled them. It was like teaching them how to swim without a pool. This was the pool. This is where they learned.
Cool. Yeah. Can you just describe what was intolerable about school that made them need to go somewhere else here?
Right. Well, they had their supports. I think of it as sort of like the scaffolding of a building. They had one-on-one aides. They had a special education team, resource teachers who they were pulled out of their class to have one-on-ones with special ed teachers, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, but then they also had the professionals come into the classroom who worked with them, sometimes exclusively, but sometimes other kids, because they weren't the only higher need kids in the classroom. And it was like what kept them up. It was like the scaffolding around a building that you were building, repairing. It was a crucial structure. And then these children, rather than comparing them to a building, they grew like a wild plant, because our kids are not buildings. And the very supports that had been put in place to kind of keep them on this road started completely constraining them, where they were no longer allowed to do things in a different way, in a different direction. So if a, and I'll use this word super lightly, if a normal, like a neurotypical kid develops like that, and I would say none of us do, I think we all develop like this, my kids developed like this with lots of help keeping them there, and then at some point they needed to develop like this and maybe come back in the middle, and maybe not, maybe they were going to land over there, and those supports constrained them rather than helping them. And what that looked like in practice was no fine motor skills, and my son couldn't tie his shoes, and I had played the you're not going to learn it unless you do it card, and got him shoelace shoes instead of Velcro shoes for the first time in his life. And so he was working on it, but when they came untied, he would need to stop everything and have a good amount of time to get them tied. Well, no one would let him stop. If you were walking in line to go from your class down to the gym or to the cafeteria, you couldn't stop and tie your shoes. And you can't tell him he can't stop and tie his shoes. His entire world would explode. A very kind classmate of his would duck in line and tie his shoes for him because he could do it quick and they could do it without tripping up the class. That was absolutely not allowed. The children were not allowed to help other children tie their shoes. I don't know if that was because there was a no-touch rule. I've heard that from other schools. I think it was simply that they just weren't allowed to function as a community with any leaning on each other. As much as the school likes to say they focus on collaborative learning and cooperative group work, the moment a kid actually tries to collaborate, to be cooperative, no, you stay in line and you march forward. And I still didn't know how bad it was until American Education Week. So I was always part of the school because I often worked as an aide for different kids in different classes. So I was part of the building, and I knew the teachers, and I'd see my kids in the hall, and I could poke my head in every now and then and say hi, and everything always seemed fine. But that American Education Week is when you're supposed to sit in the class for all, usually not a full day, but and you really kind of see much more than the quick peek in, and I couldn't believe what I saw, and more importantly, I couldn't believe that I didn't know, given that I was in the building all the time anyway. I had no idea what their actual day looked like. My older son, for the 6 hours of school, how he spent it was this and staring at the wall. And his teacher, because one of his needs in his IEP was to have his attention redirected, her idea of redirecting him was to walk in front of his desk and tap her long fingernail on the desk while she continued to talk. That was her great big effort towards inclusion. So I definitely want to make sure I give her a cookie one day. And my other son was, and that's the one who would be much more likely to just be scatterbrained and jump up and jump down. I had never seen him so still. I had never seen him have the mannerism of sitting at any table, the kitchen table, a art desk at home with like this. That wasn't his mannerism. That's how I went through school, but I'd never seen him actually, and that's how he sat at his desk the whole time. I thought, this is torture. They're sitting here, they've just learned how to wait. They weren't learning, they weren't understanding, they weren't processing, they weren't engaging. And homework at home had become increasingly a battle because I could tell they weren't understanding what it was that they were doing. And my attempts to teach them at home they had already sat still and watched the clock tick for hours that day. How could they couldn't even do it for 5 more minutes when they got home, let alone the hour or two that homework would take. That was their last day in that school. I sat there, and I was there with their dad, and he's my ex-husband, so we're not always like-minded. Even if you weren't my ex-husband, you're not always like-minded, but the fact that we looked at each other and saw the exact same thing and interpreted it in the exact same way. We are torturing our children. How long has it been like this? God, we should have pulled them out last year. God, we should have pulled them out the year before. and that was it. We cleaned out their lockers and we left.
And how long then, like, what did you do immediately after that?
I scheduled the visiting weeks here. Although I'm not telling the story in exactly the right order. I had scheduled the younger kid, who was the one who I thought would be the better fit here, because he was a little bit more social, and you know, he did like to run around a lot, and a place where he could kind of do his own thing I thought would work better for him. So he had actually already had the visiting week, just so that we'd know if it was a good fit, so that if I did ever have to pull the plug. So he had the visiting week already, and so he started pretty much. But then my other son, the one who was much more rigid and unlikely to accept any sort of change in his life, he had never done the visiting week because he didn't want to do anything different, even though where he was torture. When I offered it again the second time, after seeing how bad his day was, he grabbed it like a lifeline. And then he immediately then had his visiting week, and then they both started, I think, like that next Monday. I mean, it was just, we just didn't waste. And the funny thing is, so that was when they were in, respectively, 5th grade and 4th grade. And we said, in, you know, all of our parental wisdom, this will just be how we save them middle school years. This gets them out of the system that was quite literally hurting them, and this will spare them all that middle school, you know, trauma, which would be, you know, I mean, those are tough years for many, many kids. And then by the time they've been here and, you know, had their little break and found themselves and learned how to make friends, we'll just send them right back to high school. You know, we'll just use this as a safe place to land, and boop, and off we go. It was the connection airport. We had no desire to fly to Chicago. We were just going to use O'Hare to get to California. And after the first year here, I realized we were never going to leave, that there would be absolutely no advantage to pulling them out and sending them to high school, because they were getting everything they needed here. And even if they had been a better fit by the time they were older in high school, because they had, you know, matured, and their autism, I don't know, symptoms, for lack of a better word, had begun to, those sharp edges had blunted. There was nothing to be gained. There was nothing that they were going to learn in high school that they weren't going to get as soon as they walked into the college of their choice, even if that was a community college, even if we had to do a couple catch-up classes at community college. It would be putting them right back in this system that was so prison-like for absolutely no reason. And so we, again, kind of looked at each other and said, no, we're gonna give them their childhood. Like, not just a couple years grace period. We're gonna give them their childhood. And then, and we did. And they stayed, and I think that when other kids kind of come and go, I wish they didn't. Like, I don't think anybody should have to, like, commit to any one school for, you know, the 12 years that you send your kid to school or whatever it ends up being. But there is really something to be said for giving them their childhood, and you don't get to do that in pieces. You don't get to say you're in charge of your body in this school. You can go to the bathroom when you want. You're in charge of your time in this school. You can go to the bathroom when you want. But next year, you're no longer in charge of your body. You're also no longer in charge of your learning. You won't get to do the things that interest you. You'll have to perform for an adult agenda. And most of what you learn, you won't remember. And it's a complete waste of your time, because when you get to college, you're going to start all over. Why don't you just do it for the first time then and have your childhood? So, yeah, so they stayed.